In the archives of the state of Pennsylvania, there is a death certificate from September 1966. The cause of death reads acute coronary occlusion, a heart attack. The man it describes was 36 years old. Here is what that piece of paper does not say. The man died strapped into leather restraints on a ward of a state hospital called Farview, and the patients in the beds around him watched guards beat him across the throat and press a pillow over his face until he stopped moving. Years later, a forensic pathologist would call the death highly suspicious, and state police investigators would conclude there was strong evidence of murder. No one was ever charged. The certificate was never corrected. And inside this one hospital, that certificate was not unusual. There was a stack of them. This is the story of the hospital that produced that paper. It was a place where guards organized fights between patients and bet on the outcome, where a tranquilizer was injected into a man who was already dead, where a 30-day sentence could quietly become 30 years, and where it finally took 2 newspaper reporters, not the state, to open the files. The hospital closed decades ago. The building did not. It is a prison today, and some would say it always was. This is the dark story of Farview State Hospital, the institution Pennsylvania built for the men nobody else was allowed to hold, and then placed so far out of sight that, for 60 years, almost nobody looked. If you care about the documented stories behind America's forgotten institutions, subscribe. To understand how a heart attack could become the official language of this place, we have to go back to the mountain it was built on, and to a promise that sounded like progress. At the start of the 20th century, Pennsylvania had a category of men it did not know where to put. Every state did. They were called, in the language of the day, the criminally insane. Men who had committed crimes but were judged too sick for prison, and men in ordinary asylums judged too dangerous for a hospital ward. Prisons said they could not treat them. Hospitals said they could not hold them. Each institution passed them to the other, and both were half right. You can hear the problem in the phrase itself. Criminally insane is 2 verdicts welded together, guilty and sick, and each verdict cancels the other's institution. A prison is built on the idea that the man understood what he did. An asylum is built on the idea that he did not. So these men fell through the seam between the 2 systems, and they landed in the worst places available, in county jail cells, in locked back wards, and in iron cages in the basements of ordinary hospitals. Reformers had spent half a century arguing that the mad did not belong in prisons. Nobody had yet answered the harder question of where the mad who frightened people did belong. Pennsylvania's answer was to build one place that would take them all. The site the state chose was a plateau in the Moosic Mountains of Wayne County, in the far northeastern corner of the state, near a small town called Waymart. It stood high, remote, and cold, wrapped in fog for long stretches of the year. The name the institution took was almost tender. It was called Farview, for the fair view from the mountain. In December 1912, it opened its doors as Farview State Hospital, and the word that mattered was the last one. This was to be a hospital, and not a penitentiary. The men inside would be patients, not convicts. They would be held for treatment, not for punishment. That was the promise, and on paper, it was an enlightened one. The state was accepting responsibility for exactly the men everyone else had given up on, and the promise was believable, at first, precisely because of where the state had put it. Distance from the cities was not a flaw in the design. It was the design. The mountain offered fresh air, land to farm, and a working institution far from the slums and the jails. This was the same medical logic that had built asylums on hills all over America. The difference was the population. Other asylums held people whose families visited, wrote letters, and complained to legislators when something looked wrong. Farview, by definition, held the men with the fewest defenders in Pennsylvania. These were men whose families had often signed them away with relief, men whose word, as both criminals and lunatics in the language of the day, counted for exactly nothing twice over. So, look at the design from a different angle, and the promise turns into a warning. Farview concentrated the least sympathetic patients in the state and placed them on a mountain, hours away from the cities. Behind walls, no journalist had a reason to pass and no inspector could reach without a long drive and advance notice. A hospital like that runs on one condition: somebody outside has to keep watching. Farview opened with everything a hospital needs, except that one thing, and for the next 6 decades, the view from the mountain went in only one direction. There were 4 ways into Farview, and none of them required the word guilty. Courts sent men found not guilty by reason of insanity. Prisons sent convicts who broke down inside. Other state hospitals sent the patients they called unmanageable, the ones who fought or frightened the staff or simply kept escaping. And the 4th door was the widest one. It was called civil commitment. A man could be sent to Farview without ever being convicted of anything, on the strength of paperwork that said he was insane and dangerous. Once he was inside, there was no sentence ticking down, because there was no sentence. There was only a file. And notice what all 4 doors had in common. Each one was opened by an institution getting rid of a problem, by a court, a prison, a hospital, or a family. Nobody ever arrived at Farview because somebody wanted him treated. Men arrived because somewhere below the mountain, somebody wanted them gone. Picture what indefinite time does to a ward. A prisoner counts days. Every man in a penitentiary can tell you his release date, and the date organizes his mind. A Farview patient had nothing to count. His release depended on a doctor someday deciding he was sane, which meant, in practice, that his release depended on being examined at all. And as you are about to hear, at Farview, being examined was not something that reliably happened even once in a lifetime. Now put the medical staff next to that population. By mid-century, the institution was overfull. An inspection in 1944 counted more than 1,000 men in a facility rated for roughly 850, and the population kept climbing until it peaked at around 1,400 in 1962. Against those numbers, Farview employed, at times, between 2 and 6 physicians. Those were general doctors, not psychiatrists. When investigators finally checked in the 1970s, there was not one board-certified psychiatrist on the staff of Pennsylvania's only hospital for the criminally insane. Do that arithmetic. 1 doctor for several hundred committed men is not treatment. It is storage with a letterhead. A federal court would later be told that some men waited 26 years, some 30, for their first real psychiatric evaluation. That was not the wait for a yearly review. That was the wait for the first one. In 1971, a federal case called Dixon versus the Attorney General finally forced Pennsylvania to look at who was actually on that mountain, and the answer was astonishing. Roughly 100 of Farview's patients had never been convicted of anything at all. Hundreds of others were held long past any sentence they had once received. One man had been sent away for disorderly conduct, with a 30-day sentence. He was still inside 30 years later. Think about what that means. If he had simply served his time in the county jail, he would have been home in a month. Because his jail called him insane, the month became his life. The court ordered the Dixon men re-examined, and in the years that followed, hundreds were transferred or released. Old men walked out of a fortress they had entered young, into a world of highways and televisions that had been built entirely without them. Remember those released men, because they are about to matter twice, once as a study and once as witnesses. The doctors were absent, the sentences were meaningless, and the courts, until Dixon, were far away. So the question that actually governed daily life at Farview was never a medical one. It was much simpler. When the doctors are missing and nobody outside is watching, who runs the wards? At Farview, the answer, for decades, was the guards, and the guards had their own law. Years later, a retired Farview guard named John Norton, a man who had also served as secretary of the Guards Union, explained that law to reporters in one sentence. When a guard hit a patient, you had to jump in. If you did not, you were pulled off that ward immediately. Sit with that sentence, because everything else in this story lives inside it. The code did not say guards were allowed to beat patients. It said that when a beating started, every guard present was required to join, and the man who held back was the one who got punished. Violence was not an incident at Farview. It was a duty roster. Think about a new employee's first week on the ward. He is a local man, maybe 20 years old, hired onto the mountain because the institution was the best-paying employer for miles. The first time a beating starts in front of him, he has 1 second to choose, and the code has already made the choice for him. If he stands still, he is finished on that ward by the end of the shift. If he jumps in, he is one of them, and he can never testify, because now every witness in uniform is also a participant. The code did not just organize the violence, it manufactured the silence that protected it, one new hire at a time. Around that core, an entire economy grew. Patients worked the institution for nothing. They did the cooking, the cleaning, the hauling, and the farming, in a system of unpaid labor that investigators described as industrial peonage, and that survived into the 1970s. Peonage is a precise word, and it is worth translating. It means labor extracted from a man through captivity, and it had been illegal in the United States for a century, everywhere, apparently, except inside the institutions the state ran itself. The men were not paid, could not refuse, and could not leave, and the hospital's budget quietly depended on all three. What little they owned leaked upward. Money, cigarettes, and belongings were extorted or simply taken by the same men who held the keys. Discipline was improvised and medieval. Men were forced to strip naked, and some were shackled to cold floors. And when muscle was not enough, there was chemistry. Farview's answer to a difficult patient was thorazine or spirine, two heavy tranquilizers from the first generation of antipsychotic drugs, given at doses investigators would later describe as toxic. Used carefully, these drugs were the great psychiatric breakthrough of the century. Used the Farview way, they were a chemical version of the leather restraints. This was not medicine calibrated to heal a man. It was a dose calculated to switch him off. Keep that distinction in mind, because one of the deaths ahead turns entirely on it. And then there were the fights. On some wards, guards organized fistfights between patients the way other men organize cockfights. They paired the men off, formed a ring, and bet on the outcome. Patients fought other patients for the entertainment of the men paid to protect them. If a man refused, he faced the guards instead. It was safer to fight. A system like that produces bodies. It cannot help it. And a state institution that produces bodies has to produce paperwork to match. Which brings us back to the stack of certificates. Start in March 1960 with a patient named Thomas Garrett. He was 37. His death certificate said pulmonary embolism. That means a blood clot in the lungs, the kind of death that simply happens to a man, that requires no explanation and invites no questions. What the certificate did not mention was the scene a witness described from the month before. Garrett had been struck down in the dining hall in front of other patients, and his jaw and his ribs had been broken. He lived another month with that face. Then he died, and the paperwork reached for the blood clot. The hospital's own records contradict each other about his autopsy, and both of the doctors named in the file as having performed it later denied ever doing so. A dead patient, a broken face, and an autopsy that, on paper, 2 doctors performed and no doctor remembers. In January 1963, a patient named Russell Acel died. He was 46. 6 days earlier, according to a fellow patient, he had been beaten by a guard. The beating came not for violence and not for an escape attempt, but for complaining that meat was being stolen from the patient's kitchen. 6 days of decline on the ward followed, and then came a certificate that said heart attack. This one went a step further than Garrett's. It added a detail nobody had asked for, stating that there were no wounds or fractures. The autopsy found 3 broken ribs. Hold those 2 documents side by side, from the same institution, about the same body, and you can watch the certificate doing its real job. It was not recording a death. It was answering an accusation nobody had made yet. A man named John Rank, 68 years old, died with a sandwich in his throat. The certificate said he choked on a ham sandwich, and technically, that may even be true. What it left out was that Rank had been dosed with thorazine at more than double the therapeutic maximum, a level that suppresses the reflex that lets a man swallow, and that on the ward where he was eating, there was no nurse on the floor and no physician anywhere in the building. His body lay unrefrigerated for 14 hours. An epileptic patient named Alfred Miller, 61, was, according to witnesses, forced by guards to strip and was taunted before he died. And the doctor, who certified his death, did so by telephone, from his home nearly 20 miles away, without ever seeing the body. The surviving records leave the exact year uncertain, which tells its own story about the paperwork. Not every beating ended in a certificate. A patient named Rayford Smith survived a scrotum torn in a beating and, in his words, urinated blood for 3 months. Arthur Pitts had both shins stomped and a tooth kicked out. A witness described the body of Hayward Speaks in 1956 as looking like a piece of raw meat. These men lived. Their files, for the most part, stayed closed. If you value investigations that separate documented history from legend, subscribe, because everything in this story so far was eventually written down, under oath or on the record. And one certificate, more than any other, shows exactly how the system worked from beginning to end. It belongs to a man the other patients called Stonewall. His name was Robert Jackson. He was 36 years old, and at Farview, they called him Stonewall, after the Confederate general who shared his name. The nickname is nearly all the personality the record preserves, and that fact deserves a sentence of its own. Everything the file keeps about Robert Jackson, the restraints, the certificate, the autopsy that never happened, was written by the institution. The man himself, whoever he had been before the mountain, survives in one word the other patients chose for him. By September 1966, he was a patient on one of Farview's wards, one man among the 1,400 the state had parked on the mountain, with no reason to expect that his name would ever appear in a newspaper. On September 24, 1966, guards put Robert Jackson in leather restraints. Understand what that means physically. It means leather cuffs at the wrists, straps to the bed frame, and a man fixed on his back like cargo. Restraints were routine at Farview. That is what makes what followed so hard to look at. A restrained man is, by definition, no longer a threat to anyone. He cannot defend himself. He cannot even protect his own face. What happened next was watched by the men in the beds around him, and three of them, patients named William James Wright, William Franklin Sipes, and Clayton Allen Terhune, would later describe it independently. They said guards beat Jackson while he lay strapped down, striking him across the throat. And then, they said, a pillow was pressed over his face and held there. It stayed there until Robert Jackson stopped moving. Then the machinery of paperwork started, and it worked exactly as it had worked for Garrett and Acel before him. A doctor recorded the death. The certificate was typed and signed. The cause of death was given as acute coronary occlusion, a heart attack, at 36. The body went into the ground, the file went into the cabinet, and the ward went back to its routine. Meals continued, medication rounds continued, and shifts changed, as if the bed had simply come free. By the hospital's own account of itself, nothing had happened at all. That is the part to hold on to. Not just that a man may have been killed, but that the institution had a form ready that made the killing disappear. And everyone involved knew the form would never be questioned, because on that mountain, no form had ever been questioned. For 10 years, the paper version of Robert Jackson's death was the only version that officially existed. 10 years is long enough for guards to retire, for wards to be repainted, for a case to become safely historical. But the men in those beds did not forget, because you do not forget watching that. When investigators finally came asking, a decade later, Wright and Sipes and Terhune each told the same story they had seen from their beds. 3 accounts, given independently, agreed on the restraints, the blows to the throat, and the pillow. A veteran forensic pathologist, Dr. Halbert Fillinger, reviewed the case and said the death was of a highly suspicious nature and that it may well have been suffocation. The Pennsylvania State Police went further. Their investigators concluded there was strong evidence of murder. Strong evidence of murder. That phrase comes from the state's own police, about a death inside the state's own hospital. And here is the fact this entire story turns on. Nobody was ever charged with anything. Nobody was charged for Jackson, or for Garrett, or for Acel. Nobody was ever charged for any death at Farview. To understand how that is possible, you have to watch what the state did when it was given the chance to act. Because it was given the chance twice. In November 1974, Pennsylvania's Attorney General, Israel Packle, ordered an investigation into Farview. The subject matter was explicit. It named threats, beatings, illegal contraband, and deaths. For the men on the mountain, this was the moment the system was supposed to correct itself. The state's chief law officer was formally asking whether the state's own hospital was killing its patients. 17 months later, on April 16, 1975, Packle's successor, Robert Kane, announced the result. The investigation had found no evidence supporting allegations of criminal violations. No evidence. In the same period, the state police files on the Jackson case contained their conclusion of strong evidence of murder. Both of those sentences were sitting in Harrisburg at the same time, and only one of them was read aloud. How does an investigation find nothing on a mountain covered in certificates? A bureau director named Cecil Yates later offered an answer, and it is the quiet kind of damning. The investigation, he said, had been superficial. When investigators studied injuries, they analyzed the files of injured guards, but not the files of injured patients. Read that again. The state examined the violence at Farview by counting the guards' bruises. Meanwhile, in 1975, a researcher working with the National Institute of Mental Health interviewed 269 former Farview patients, men who had been transferred or released after the Dixon ruling. The study was not even about abuse. Nobody sitting across from these men asked a single question about violence, yet 45% of them brought it up on their own, unprompted, describing beatings they had seen or received. Consider what that number means as evidence. These were men scattered across different hospitals and towns, interviewed separately, with no way to coordinate a story and nothing to gain from telling one. Almost half of them volunteered the same account of the same place. It was the account the Attorney General's office had just declared unsupported by evidence. The evidence had never been missing. It walked out of Farview on two legs, hundreds of times over, and the state had simply never asked it anything. The state had investigated itself and cleared itself. The courts had freed the men Dixon could reach and stopped there, which meant that by 1976, exactly one path onto that mountain was left, and it did not belong to the government. At the Philadelphia Inquirer, a complaint about Farview reached the newsroom. Accounts differ on who sent it, a grieving mother or a former patient, but it landed on the desks of two reporters, Acel and Wendell Rawls Jr. Neither man had any official power. They could not subpoena a file, exhume a body, or compel a single interview. What they had was 3 months, a car, and the one advantage the state had never used. They actually wanted to know. So they went and found the witnesses the system had scattered. They found former patients across the state, many of them Dixon men, whose testimony had been worthless for decades because of where they had lived, and who now told their stories in their own living rooms. They found former employees willing to talk, including guards, some of them carrying years of things they had seen and joined and could not put down. And then the reporters did the quiet, unglamorous thing this entire story had been waiting 60 years for. They pulled death certificates and matched them against autopsy records and eyewitness accounts, name by name, date by date. They did, in other words, the thing 17 months of official investigation had not done. They read the patient's files. In the summer of 1976, the Inquirer began publishing what they found in a series that became known as the Farview Findings. They printed the beatings and the code that required guards to join them. They printed the organized fights and the betting, the tranquilizers at toxic doses, the extortion, the forced nakedness, and the men shackled to cold floors. And above all, they printed the deaths. Jackson, Acel, Garrett, and the others were laid out next to the certificates that had converted each of them into natural causes. One detail from those pages stays with every reader. A patient named Calvin Bush, 32 years old, died in October 1973 while 8 guards held him down. One of them, a man weighing roughly 200 pounds, sitting on his chest. His certificate blamed a heart rhythm disorder, aggravated by excitement, and then a dose of aspirin was injected into him after he was already dead. A syringe was emptied into a corpse, as if the paperwork needed the drug to be somewhere other than the vial. The series detonated. Pennsylvania could no longer claim there was no evidence. The evidence was on the front page, with names. A grand jury was convened, and prosecutors eventually charged roughly 3 dozen current and former Farview employees. Then the mountain defended itself one last time. Witnesses were patients, and patients could be discredited. Colleagues closed ranks behind the code. In the end, of all those men, exactly one was convicted of assault. Everyone else was acquitted, or their cases were dismissed. And for the deaths, for Jackson under his pillow, for Acel and his 3 broken ribs, for Garrett's autopsy that no doctor remembers performing, the final score was precise. No one was ever convicted of anything. In 1977, Acel Moore and Wendell Rawls Jr. received the Pulitzer Prize for the Farview findings. It is worth saying plainly what that prize marks. It marks not a rescue by the system, but a rescue from outside it. The courts had reached Farview in 1971, the Attorney General in 1974, and the mountain had absorbed both. What it could not absorb was two reporters with a stack of death certificates and the patience to read them. After the series, Farview could no longer be invisible, and an institution like Farview cannot survive being seen. Everything it ran on, from the code to the certificates to the peonage to the sedation, required that nobody outside was looking, and now everyone was. Oversight arrived, the unpaid labour ended, staff changed, and the population fell year after year as courts and doctors did. At last, the re-examinations that should never have stopped. The wards slowly emptied, in the same quiet ending that came for asylums all over America, arriving here with a Pulitzer attached. In 1995, after 83 years, Farview State Hospital closed. But here is the detail that separates Farview from almost every other asylum in this series. The building did not become a ruin, or a museum, or apartments with a difficult history. The state of Pennsylvania kept it, renamed it, and filled it again. The complex on the mountain is now the State Correctional Institution at Waymart. It is a prison, with a forensic treatment center for mentally ill inmates. Men judged both criminal and mentally ill are held there today, on the same plateau, behind the same walls, under the same fog. Pennsylvania built Farview as a hospital that was not supposed to be a prison. It took 83 years for the sign at the gate to catch up with the facts. On that mountain, only the paperwork ever really changed. Which is fitting, because paperwork is what this story was always about. Go back one last time to the certificate from September 1966, to the ordinary form, the calm handwriting, and the heart attack at 36. In 1912, paper made Farview possible. A commitment order was all it took to move a man onto the mountain forever. In 1966, paper made Farview safe. A certificate was all it took to move a man underground without a question. And in 1976, paper is what finally brought Farview down, when the same certificates were pulled from the same cabinets and read at last by someone who compared them to the bodies they described. When it was written, that certificate was a shield. It protected the ward, the shift, the institution, the state. The only person it did not serve was the man it named. But paper is patient. It outlived the guard's code, and the failed investigation, and the hospital itself, and when someone finally held it next to the testimony of 3 men who watched from their beds, the shield became the evidence. The lie, filed in triplicate, is how we know the truth. Robert Jackson has no memorial. Neither do Russell Sell, or Thomas Garrett, or Calvin Bush, or John Rank, or Alfred Miller. What they have is a file, and the answer to the question this hospital could never answer. That question is what happens to the men a state locks away where nobody can see. The honest answer is that it depends entirely on who is willing to look. For 60 years at Farview, nobody looked, and the certificate said heart attack. Then 2 people looked, and the same certificate said murder. The fog still settles on the Moosic Mountains, over a full prison with a fair view. Somewhere in an archive below, the stack of certificates is still filed under natural causes. If you reached the end of this story, subscribe for the next investigation into America's forgotten institutions.